Beneath the golden chandeliers of Versailles, in the shadowed corridors of Spanish palaces, and across the sun-drenched hills of southern Italy, a single dynasty quietly shaped the destiny of Europe for centuries. Their story is one of power and splendor, but also of secrets, struggles, and unexpected twists. From celebrated monarchs to forgotten reformers, from artists who redefined beauty to courtiers who rewrote politics behind closed doors, the Bourbon legacy is filled with tales you've likely never heard. But once you do, you'll never see European history the same way again. Welcome to Words of Time. And in this video, we will journey deep into the untold stories of the Bourbon Dynasty, uncover their hidden impact on culture, society, and art, and explore how their legacy continues to shape our modern world. Let's begin. The story of the Bourbon Dynasty begins in the heart of medieval Europe, tracing its lineage to one of the cadet branches of the Capetian dynasty. Over time, through marriage alliances, strategic diplomacy, and the slow consolidation of power, the Bourbons emerged as the dominant ruling family in France. Their ascent to the French throne was not instantaneous, but rather a gradual process marked by both fortune and calculated political maneuvering. The founder of the Bourbon dynasty as a ruling power in France was Henry of Navarre, who became Henry IV of France. Born into a Protestant branch of the family during a time of great religious strife, his reign marked a turning point in French history. His accession to the throne in the late 16th century came at the end of the brutal wars of religion, which had ravaged France for decades. Henry's pragmatic decision to convert to Catholicism, famously rationalized by his supposed remark that Paris is worth a mass, helped to bring an end to the religious civil wars that had deeply fractured the country. His issuance of the Edict of Nantes in the closing years of the 16th century granted a degree of religious tolerance to the Huguenots, a significant Protestant minority, and laid the groundwork for a more stable and unified kingdom. Henry IV's legacy was carried on by his son, Louis XIII, who strengthened the monarchy with the help of Cardinal Richelieu, his influential chief minister. Richelieu's tenure saw the monarchy consolidate power further by suppressing internal dissent and reducing the influence of the nobility. It was under Richelieu that France began asserting itself more confidently on the European stage, intervening in the 30 Years' War and gradually expanding its influence beyond its borders. However, it was under Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, that the Bourbon dynasty reached the zenith of its power and influence. His reign, which lasted over 7 decades, is one of the longest in European history and serves as a defining chapter in the story of absolute monarchy. Louis XIV transformed the French monarchy into a near-total autocracy, where the king was seen as the embodiment of the state. His famous phrase, "I am the state," captures the essence of absolutist rule. During his reign, the Palace of Versailles was expanded into a symbol of royal grandeur and political control. Not only did it house the royal family, but it also became a tool for taming the nobility, who were required to live at court and compete for royal favor, effectively neutralizing their regional power bases. Louis XIV's foreign policy was marked by aggressive expansionism. He pursued wars aimed at securing natural borders and asserting French dominance in Europe. Though these wars brought temporary glory, they also placed a heavy financial burden on the state. The monarch's lavish lifestyle, coupled with military campaigns, drained the treasury and sowed the seeds of future unrest. The successors of Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI, struggled to maintain the strength and prestige that their predecessor had built. Louis XV's reign was marked by indecision and the erosion of royal authority, while Louis XVI inherited a kingdom on the brink of financial collapse. By the late 18th century, widespread dissatisfaction with the monarchy had taken hold, driven by economic hardship, social inequality, and the growing influence of Enlightenment ideas that questioned traditional authority. The culmination of this discontent was the French Revolution, which erupted in the closing years of the 18th century. Louis XV's attempts to reform the financial system failed to quell popular anger, and his indecisiveness in the face of mounting pressure led to the eventual downfall of the Bourbon monarchy. He was arrested, tried for treason, and executed by guillotine in the early months of the Revolution. With his death, the centuries-old Bourbon dynasty came to an abrupt end, at least temporarily. The Bourbon family, however, did not vanish from the political scene. After the fall of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna restored the Bourbons to the throne in the person of Louis XVIII, the the brother of the executed king. This restoration was part of a broader conservative reaction against the revolutionary upheavals that had swept Europe. Louis XVIII and his successor, Charles X, attempted to re-establish the old order, but the political landscape had shifted irreversibly. The July Revolution of the early 19th century forced Charles X to abdicate, bringing an end to Bourbon rule in France once more. Throughout their centuries-long involvement in French governance, the Bourbons profoundly shaped the nation's identity, culture, and political structures. They centralized authority, cultivated a powerful and culturally vibrant court, and left behind a legacy of architectural and artistic achievements that defined the grandeur of the French state. Their rule, particularly under Louis XIV, laid the foundation for modern concepts of centralized governance and state sovereignty, even as it exemplified the dangers of autocratic excess. Beyond the borders of France, the Bourbon dynasty exerted significant influence across Europe. Strategic marriages and dynastic alliances extended Bourbon power into other realms. One of the most notable examples is Spain, where the Bourbon family assumed control in the early 18th century. The War of the Spanish Succession, which erupted at the beginning of the century, was fought over the claim of Philip of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIV, to the Spanish throne. Despite fierce resistance from a coalition of European powers, Philip secured the crown as Philip V, establishing the Bourbon dynasty in Spain, a line that continues to this day. The Spanish Bourbons brought French-style centralization and reform to their new kingdom. Under their rule, Spain attempted to modernize its administration and reassert control over its vast colonial empire. Bourbon monarchs like Charles III implemented enlightened absolutist policies, improving infrastructure, education, and state bureaucracy. However, the Spanish Bourbons also had to grapple with growing demands for independence among their colonial possessions, particularly in the Americas. In Italy, the Bourbons established additional branches of their dynasty. In the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the Bourbons ruled as a separate line, descending from the Spanish branch. Their governance left a lasting impact on the region, particularly in terms of architectural development and the fostering of arts and sciences. The Bourbon presence in southern Italy was marked by both reformist efforts and resistance to liberal revolutions, leading to complex legacies in the modern historical consciousness of the region. In the wider European context, the Bourbon dynasty played a central role in shaping the balance of power. Their alliances, rivalries, and territorial claims were pivotal factors in many of the continent's major conflicts, from the 30 Years' War to the Napoleonic Wars. The fear of a pan-European Bourbon hegemony motivated coalitions against France and Spain, influencing diplomatic and military strategies for generations. Culturally, the Bourbons were patrons of the arts and champions of intellectual life, particularly during the Age of Enlightenment. Their courts attracted artists, philosophers, architects, and scientists from across Europe. Versailles, under Louis XIV, became a symbol not only of monarchical power, but also of cultural excellence. The ideals and aesthetics developed under Bourbon patronage helped to define European high culture for centuries and inspired emulation by other royal courts. The influence of the Bourbon dynasty extended even further through their contributions to legal and administrative traditions. The codification of laws, the structuring of centralized bureaucracies, and the development of professional militaries under their reign became models for other monarchies seeking to modernize. In this sense, the Bourbons were both a product of the old feudal order and pioneers of early modern governance. The fall of the Bourbons in France, brought about by revolution and republican ideals, did not entirely extinguish their ideological legacy. Even as monarchies fell or adapted to constitutional limits, the Bourbon model of centralized authority and state-sponsored culture left a lasting imprint. In Spain, despite interruptions from republican movements and dictatorship, the Bourbon line was restored once again in the latter part of the 20th century, with Juan Carlos I playing a pivotal role in Spain's transition to democracy. The endurance of the Bourbon legacy is a testament to their historical significance. Few dynasties have exerted such broad and long-lasting influence across multiple countries, shaping not only their immediate realms, but also the trajectory of European politics and culture. The Bourbon name remains associated with opulence, absolutism, and reform, embodying both the grandeur and the contradictions of monarchical rule. The broader consequences of Bourbon rule also illuminate the complexities of state building and governance. While they contributed to the development of strong centralized states, they often did so at the expense of popular participation and social equity. The absolutist tendencies of their reigns, particularly in France, created conditions that ultimately led to revolution and dramatic political change. Their story is one of immense power, cultural achievement, and eventual reckoning with the forces of modernity. The Bourbon dynasty's impact on France and Europe is a study in contrasts. They were builders and reformers, yet also autocrats and traditionalists. They promoted Enlightenment ideals, even as they resisted democratic change. They ruled over golden ages and periods of decline. Through it all, their legacy endures in the palaces they built, the institutions they shaped, and the political ideals they either championed or resisted. Their connection to France and Europe runs deep, shaping a historical narrative that continues to inform our understanding of monarchy, power, and the evolution of modern states. The arrival of the Bourbons in Spain at the beginning of the 18th century marked a profound turning point in the country's political, cultural, and social history. Their ascension to the Spanish throne was not the result of domestic succession, but was born out of a European conflict that had far-reaching implications. The death of the childless Charles II of the Habsburg dynasty in the closing years of the 17th century led to a dynastic crisis. Charles had named Philip of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir. This decision alarmed other European powers, who feared a union between the French and Spanish crowns. The ensuing War of the Spanish Succession was not merely a battle for the Spanish throne, but a conflict that redefined the balance of power in Europe. The war lasted over a decade and ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in the early 18th century. Though Philip was recognized as Philip V, King of Spain, it came with the condition that the French and Spanish crowns could never be united. The arrival of the Bourbon dynasty in Spain was therefore not just a change in rulers. It was a shift in the very foundation of Spanish governance and identity. The new dynasty brought with it a fresh vision inspired by French centralization and absolutism. This had both immediate and long-term consequences for Spanish institutions, society, and its global empire. Philip V introduced numerous reforms to streamline governance, reduce regional autonomy, and strengthen the monarchy. The traditional patchwork of kingdoms and regional privileges that had characterized Spain under the Habsburgs began to give way to a more centralized model. One of the first major legislative steps taken under Philip was the issuance of the Nueva Planta decrees. These effectively abolished the historical charters and privileges of several Spanish regions, especially in the Crown of Aragon, and replaced them with a uniform system of laws and administration modeled after the Castilian system. This move was aimed at reducing the fragmented nature of the Spanish monarchy and increasing royal authority across the peninsula. The arrival of the Bourbons also marked a shift in how Spanish identity was conceptualized. While the Habsburgs had tolerated a certain level of regional diversity, the Bourbons pushed toward a unified national identity that emphasized central governance, linguistic uniformity, and loyalty to the crown. Over time, this vision influenced everything from education to public ceremonies. The monarchy increasingly became the symbol of a singular Spanish nation rather than a collection of loosely federated territories. Economically and militarily, the Spanish Bourbons inherited an empire in decline, but they were determined to arrest and reverse that decline. The 18th century saw a concerted effort to reform the economy, modernize the military, and reinvigorate the overseas colonies. The Bourbon kings, particularly Charles III, who ruled in the second half of the 18th century, were inspired by the principles of enlightened absolutism. They believed in strong centralized rule, but also embraced rational reforms designed to improve the state and the lives of its citizens. This blend of authoritarian governance and progressive policy marked much of the Bourbon approach to ruling Spain and its empire. Colonial expansion and reform were central to the Bourbon project. By the time the Bourbons took power, Spain's empire in the Americas was vast but plagued by inefficiency, corruption, and administrative stagnation. The new dynasty set about reorganizing the colonial administration in an effort to extract more wealth and exercise tighter control. One of the most important changes was the introduction of the intendant system, which placed royal officials directly in charge of administrative regions in the colonies. These intendants reported to the crown rather than to local colonial elites, thereby reducing the influence of entrenched power structures and ensuring greater loyalty to the monarchy. The economic exploitation of the colonies was also intensified. The Bourbons sought to increase revenues from colonial trade, mining, and agriculture. New commercial policies loosened the stranglehold of monopoly trading companies and allowed for more open trade between Spain and its American colonies. This helped stimulate colonial economies, increased tax revenues, and integrated the empire more closely into global trade networks. However, it also placed additional burdens on colonial populations, especially indigenous communities and enslaved people, who bore the brunt of intensified extraction and exploitation. The Bourbon reforms had significant global consequences. The reorganization of the empire strengthened Spain's hand in the global competition for resources and territory, particularly in the Americas. It also brought Spain into closer contact, and often conflict, with other colonial powers such as Britain, France, and Portugal. The Bourbon monarchs invested heavily in fortifications, navies, and military expeditions to protect their interests overseas. These investments helped maintain Spanish presence in the Caribbean, Central and South America, and even the Pacific, where Spanish ships reached as far as the Philippines and the west coast of North America. Despite these efforts, the increased control and exploitation of the colonies led to growing dissatisfaction and ultimately to calls for independence. The reforms disrupted traditional power structures and alienated both local elites and the broader population. In the long term, the Bourbon policies contributed to the very forces that would later lead to the dissolution of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. From the late 18th century onward, the colonies began to agitate for greater autonomy and eventually full independence. The Napoleonic invasion of Spain in the early 19th century provided the final spark, and by the middle of that century, Spain had lost nearly all of its American territories. Alongside political and economic reform, the Spanish Bourbons were also patrons of culture, art, and architecture. They played a pivotal role in transforming Madrid into a modern European capital and sponsored numerous projects that enriched the cultural life of the nation. The Bourbon court, particularly under Charles III, was heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideals and by the artistic trends then flourishing in France and Italy. This influence found expression in architecture, urban planning, and the visual arts. Charles III was a reform-minded monarch who, before becoming King of Spain, had ruled Naples and Sicily. His experiences in Italy left a lasting impact on his tastes and policies. Upon ascending to the Spanish throne, he launched an ambitious program of modernization. One of his greatest legacies was the transformation of Madrid into a neoclassical city. He sponsored the construction of public buildings, parks, and monuments that reflected Enlightenment ideals of order, symmetry, and civic virtue. Among the most iconic projects were the Royal Palace of Madrid, the Puerto de Isela, and the Prado Museum, which would later become one of the world's most important art institutions. The Spanish Bourbon court also played a vital role in the development of the arts. Painters, sculptors, and architects were brought from across Europe to work on royal projects, and Spanish artists were supported through commissions and academies. The court encouraged the foundation of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando, which became a hub for training and promoting new generations of Spanish artists. Under Bourbon patronage, Spanish art began to reflect the broader currents of European neoclassicism, moving away from the Baroque and religious styles that had dominated the previous century. The influence of the Bourbon court extended beyond Madrid and into the provinces and colonies. Architectural and artistic styles promoted at the center were emulated across the empire, creating a shared visual and cultural language that linked Spanish cities with colonial capitals such as Mexico City, Lima, and Buenos Aires. Churches, government buildings, and palaces in the Americas were built or renovated in neoclassical and Baroque styles that echoed the aesthetics of the Bourbon metropole. This cultural diffusion helped reinforce imperial identity, even as political tensions simmered beneath the surface. Music, literature, and philosophy also flourished under the Bourbon monarchs. Though they exercised strict censorship, the kings and their ministers supported Enlightenment thinkers who remained loyal to the crown. Translations of foreign scientific and philosophical works were encouraged, and educational institutions were reformed to emphasize reason, science, and civic responsibility. Libraries and observatories were founded, and efforts were made to standardize education across the kingdom and its colonies. This cultural flowering was not without contradictions. While the Bourbons embraced Enlightenment ideals, They did so within the framework of absolute monarchy. The promotion of reason and progress was carefully controlled to prevent challenges to royal authority. The same monarchs who supported scientific academies and urban renewal also resisted constitutionalism and democracy. This tension between progressive ideals and authoritarian governance was one of the defining features of Bourbon rule in Spain and its empire. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the Spanish Bourbons found themselves confronting a rapidly changing world. The French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon sent shockwaves through the European monarchies. In Spain, these developments culminated in the Napoleonic invasion and the brief installation of Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. Though the Bourbons were restored after Napoleon's defeat, their authority was weakened, and the empire began to fracture. One by one, the colonies declared independence, and the Bourbon kings struggled to adapt to the new political realities. Despite these challenges, the Bourbon Dynasty persisted in Spain. The later monarchs, including Ferdinand VII and Isabella II, navigated a period of intense political upheaval that included civil wars, constitutional experiments, and foreign interventions. The monarchy was briefly overthrown and restored multiple times, reflecting the deep divisions within Spanish society. Yet through it all, the Bourbon name remained a symbol of continuity, authority, and national identity. In the modern era, the Bourbon monarchy has played a more ceremonial role, especially following the end of the Franco dictatorship in the 20th century. King Juan Carlos I, a Bourbon, was instrumental in guiding Spain toward democracy after decades of authoritarian rule. His decision to support democratic reforms and his role in defusing an attempted military coup in the early 80s earned him broad public support. Though the institution of the monarchy has faced criticism and controversy in recent years, the Bourbon legacy remains deeply embedded in the fabric of Spanish history. The story of the Spanish Bourbons is one of adaptation, ambition, and complexity. Their arrival transformed Spain's identity and reshaped its empire. Through political reform, cultural patronage, and colonial expansion, they left an indelible mark on the Spanish-speaking world. The consequences of their rule continue to resonate, from the architecture of Madrid to the independence movements of Latin America. Their legacy is a reminder of how dynastic power can influence not only the fate of nations, but also the cultural and historical consciousness of entire continents. The history of the Italian Bourbons, particularly their rule over the Kingdom of Naples and the Kingdom of Sicily, later united into the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, is a complex narrative shaped by ambition, reform, resistance, and ultimate decline. The Bourbon dynasty's rise in southern Italy was part of a broader reshaping of European political power in the 18th century. Following the War of the Spanish Succession, which had major implications across Europe, Spain lost control of many of its European territories. However, later in the same century, the Spanish Bourbons reasserted their influence in Italy through strategic diplomacy and military campaigns, resulting in the establishment of a new Bourbon branch in Naples and Sicily. This southern realm would eventually become the largest and most populous of the Italian states before unification. The kingdoms of Naples and Sicily had long and diverse histories before Bourbon rule. Located in the south of the Italian peninsula and on the island of Sicily, these territories had seen centuries of conquest and change, from Norman and Hohenstaufen rule to Angevin and Aragonese dominance. By the early 18th century, both kingdoms had been under Spanish Habsburg control, and their political, economic, and social structures were deeply influenced by the feudal traditions and religious conservatism that had characterized much of southern European governance. In the first half of the 18th century, during the War of the Polish Succession, Spain sent troops to reclaim Naples and Sicily from Austrian control. In the mid-18th century, the Spanish Prince Charles of Bourbon, later known as Charles III, became King of Naples and Sicily. His reign marked the beginning of a new chapter for southern Italy. Though Charles would later leave for Spain to ascend to the Spanish throne, his rule in Italy laid the foundation for Bourbon influence in the region, which would continue under his son and successors. Charles's administration in Naples and Sicily focused on strengthening royal authority, reducing noble power, and modernizing various aspects of governance. He surrounded himself with ministers and advisors who were influenced by Enlightenment ideas. These reforms aimed to reduce corruption, promote economic development, and enhance state control over legal and administrative functions. During his time in Italy, Charles undertook significant cultural and architectural projects, building grand palaces, museums, and theaters. The royal palace of Caserta, often called the Versailles of Italy, remains one of the most iconic symbols of Bourbon rule in Naples, reflecting both the grandeur and the ambition of the dynasty. When Charles left for Spain, he appointed his son Ferdinand as King of Naples and Sicily. Ferdinand, later known as Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies, would go on to rule for many decades. His reign was marked by both attempts at reform and fierce resistance to liberal and revolutionary movements. Although his early rule continued some of the modernization efforts begun by his father, the political climate in Europe was changing rapidly, particularly with the outbreak of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon. The influence of revolutionary France was deeply felt in southern Italy. In the late 18th century, during one of Napoleon's military campaigns, the French invaded Naples, and Ferdinand was forced to flee to Sicily. For a short period, the Parthenopean Republic was established in Naples by pro-French revolutionaries, but it was quickly crushed by royalist forces with help from the British Navy and local loyalist groups. When Ferdinand returned to power, he initiated a brutal crackdown on suspected revolutionaries and sympathizers. Thousands were arrested, executed, or exiled, and a long period of reactionary rule followed. Despite these setbacks, the Bourbon monarchs in Naples and Sicily recognized the need to address the internal challenges facing their kingdoms. The region was plagued by poverty, inefficient governance, and the lingering power of a landed aristocracy that resisted change. The monarchy attempted to introduce administrative reforms, encourage agriculture, and build infrastructure such as roads and ports. However, these efforts were often undermined by corruption, limited resources, and resistance from powerful local interests. One of the central challenges for the Bourbon rulers in southern Italy was the vast gap between the aristocracy and the general population. Most of the rural poor lived in dire conditions, working on estates owned by absentee landlords or the church. Education was limited, and the feudal structure remained deeply entrenched. While the Bourbons sought to modernize aspects of governance, they largely avoided addressing the underlying social inequalities that defined the kingdom. This disconnect would later contribute to the weakening of their authority and the rise of revolutionary sentiment. In the early 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars once again altered the balance of power in Italy. Napoleon invaded southern Italy, and Ferdinand was again forced to flee. Napoleon installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Naples, later replaced by his brother-in-law Joachim Murat. These Napoleonic rulers introduced a wave of reforms aimed at modernizing the state along French lines. Feudal privileges were abolished, secular education was promoted, and new legal codes were introduced. While the French rule was short-lived, many of these changes had lasting impacts on the region. After Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna in the early 19th century restored the Bourbon monarchy. Ferdinand returned as king and merged the two kingdoms into a single entity, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. This reunification was symbolic of Bourbon resilience, but it also marked the beginning of a slow and uneven decline. Though the monarchy reasserted control and rolled back many Napoleonic reforms, the memory of revolution and the taste of modern governance lingered among the people, especially among the emerging middle classes and intellectual elites. The Bourbon rulers in the Two Sicilies faced increasing pressure in the mid-19th century as the winds of Italian nationalism began to sweep across the peninsula. The idea of a unified Italy, free from foreign rule and local despotism, began to gain traction. The Bourbons, who governed the most conservative and isolated of the Italian states, found themselves increasingly out of step with the rest of the peninsula. Their resistance to constitutional reform, press freedom, and representative government alienated many, including former allies. Throughout the reign of Ferdinand II, who came to power in the mid-19th century, the monarchy maintained a strict autocracy, relying heavily on police surveillance and censorship. While some infrastructure projects were initiated, such as railways and telegraphs, these were limited and often intended more for military control than public benefit. The administration became increasingly rigid and suspicious, fearing conspiracies and revolts. Political dissidents were imprisoned, and revolutionary groups were suppressed with violence. When Ferdinand II died and his son Francis II took the throne, the kingdom was already teetering on the edge of crisis. Francis was young, inexperienced, and hesitant to implement the reforms that might have saved his throne. Meanwhile, the Italian unification movement, led by figures like Giuseppe Garibaldi and Count Cavour, was gaining momentum. In the late 1850s, Garibaldi launched his famous expedition of the Thousand, landing in Sicily with a small group of volunteers. To the surprise of many, the campaign rapidly gained support from locals who were disillusioned with Bourbon rule. As Garibaldi advanced through the south, he encountered little resistance. The Bourbon army, plagued by desertions and low morale, was unable to stop his march. Francis II retreated to the fortress city of Gaeta, where he made a final stand. After a prolonged siege, Gaeta fell, and with it, the Bourbon monarchy in southern Italy came to an end. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies was annexed to the newly formed Kingdom of Italy, marking a major milestone in the unification process. The fall of the Italian Bourbons was the result of a combination of internal stagnation, external pressures, and a failure to adapt to changing political realities. Though they had ruled for more than a century and had made efforts to modernize, their commitment to absolutism and resistance to liberal ideas ultimately isolated them from their own people. Their downfall was not just a military defeat, but a failure of governance, vision, and legitimacy. In the decades that followed unification, the former territories of the Two Sicilies struggled with economic and social challenges that had deep roots in the Bourbon era. The south of Italy remained less developed than the north, and the legacy of feudalism, poor infrastructure, and limited education continued to affect generations. While the Bourbons had attempted to leave their mark through grand architecture and cultural patronage, their inability to foster broader prosperity and political inclusion defined their legacy for many Italians. Yet the Bourbon legacy is not entirely one of failure. Their reign saw moments of cultural brilliance, administrative reform, and architectural achievement. Their palaces, theaters, and gardens still stand today as reminders of a dynasty that once ruled a significant portion of Europe with grandeur and ambition. In historical memory, the Bourbons of Naples and Sicily remain controversial figures, both criticized for their repression and remembered for their contributions to Italian culture and heritage. Their story is ultimately a reflection of the broader struggles faced by monarchies in the age of revolution and nationalism. The Bourbons of Italy, like their relatives in France and Spain, sought to balance tradition with the demands of modern governance. In their case, the balance proved elusive. Their reign, marked by moments of enlightenment and repression, mirrors the contradictions of the era they lived in. Their fall marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the dawn of a new chapter in Italian history, one defined not by royal families, but by the aspirations of a unified people seeking to forge their own destiny. The Bourbon Dynasty, one of the most influential royal families in European history, has shaped the continent not only through its monarchs and their reigns, but also through the intricate network of marriages, rivalries, and political maneuvering that defined its centuries-long presence. Though most commonly associated with France and later Spain, the Bourbons have extended their reach across numerous countries, intertwining with other powerful houses such as the Habsburgs, the Savoys, and the Romanovs. The story of the Bourbons is not simply one of thrones and territories. It is the story of dynastic continuity, collapse, and rebirth. Their legacy transcends the structures of monarchy and permeates the modern political and cultural identity of Europe. At the core of the Bourbon dynasty lies an elaborate family tree, a web of lineage that spans from the Capetian kings of medieval France to present-day royalty. The Bourbons originated as a cadet branch of the Capetian family, which had ruled France since the late 10th century. Through the centuries, strategic marriages and political cunning allowed the Bourbons to consolidate their power and expand their influence far beyond the borders of France. The marriage of Henry of Navarre into the French royal line in the late 16th century marked the foundation of Bourbon rule in France. His ascension as Henry IV brought stability to a nation torn by religious conflict and began the transformation of the Bourbon family into one of Europe's dominant dynasties. From the outset, the Bourbons understood the importance of marriage alliances as tools of diplomacy and dominance. They married into the ruling families of Spain, Italy, and various German states, forging a tight network of connections that both unified and divided Europe. One of the most consequential of these alliances was between the French Bourbons and the Spanish crown. When Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, became King of Spain in the early 18th century, a new Spanish Bourbon line was born. This caused great concern among other European powers, as a potential union of France and Spain under a single family could shift the continental balance of power. The resulting War of the Spanish Succession was a defining moment for the Bourbons, ultimately confirming their place in Spanish history while permanently altering the geopolitical landscape. The Bourbons were not always united in purpose or ideology. The French and Spanish branches often pursued divergent paths, particularly during the upheavals of the 18th and 19th centuries. Within each branch, internal divisions, rival claims, and differing visions of monarchy created rivalries that extended far beyond family drama. These rivalries played out in European courts, on battlefields, and in diplomatic corridors, influencing decisions that affected millions. The complexity of Bourbon internal politics sometimes weakened their collective strength, especially during times of crisis. Nowhere was this complexity more visible than during the Napoleonic Wars, a period of unprecedented upheaval in Europe. The French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte shattered the old order, threatening not just the Bourbon monarchy in France, but monarchies throughout the continent. The execution of Louis XVI in the late 18th century marked the end of the ancient regime in France and sent shockwaves across Europe. The French Bourbons, long accustomed to absolute rule, were suddenly exiled and hunted, their symbols of power dismantled, their very existence questioned by the tide of republicanism. During Napoleon's meteoric rise, the Bourbon family found themselves dispersed and divided. Some fled to foreign courts, seeking asylum and support for restoration, while others attempted to build coalitions against the French Empire. Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed king, proclaimed himself the rightful monarch from exile and worked tirelessly to win the backing of Britain and other anti-Napoleonic powers. Despite their royal status, the Bourbons were now pawns in a larger struggle between the old order and the revolutionary forces reshaping Europe. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Bourbon monarch Charles IV faced his own crisis. Napoleon manipulated Spanish politics to his advantage, ultimately forcing Charles and his son Ferdinand to abdicate. The French emperor placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne, sparking widespread resistance and guerrilla warfare. The Spanish people, deeply attached to the idea of monarchy, rejected French control, and the Peninsular War became a brutal theater of conflict. Spanish Bourbons, though removed from direct power, became symbols of resistance and legitimacy. Their eventual restoration after Napoleon's defeat was seen as a triumph for tradition, though it came with many concessions and changes. The end of the Napoleonic Wars brought about the Congress of Vienna, a grand diplomatic effort to restore stability to a continent in chaos. For the Bourbons, it was a moment of redemption. The French monarchy was restored under Louis XVIII, though it was now a constitutional monarchy with limited powers. The Spanish Bourbons returned to Madrid, while the Italian Bourbons regained control of Naples and Sicily. Though restored, they now faced new realities. The days of unquestioned divine right were fading, and the demands of nationalism, liberalism, and constitutional governance were rising. The Bourbon monarchs struggled to adapt to the new political environment. In France, Charles X, who succeeded his brother, attempted to reassert absolute authority, resulting in the July Revolution and his forced abdication. He was replaced by Louis Philippe from the House of Orleans, a cadet branch of the Bourbons, who ruled as the citizen king in a more bourgeois, constitutional fashion. This period of monarchy would also be short-lived, as France continued to oscillate between republic, empire, and monarchy throughout the 19th century. In Spain, Ferdinand VII restored absolutist rule, rolling back the liberal constitution that had emerged during the Napoleonic era. His actions sparked civil conflict and laid the groundwork for future instability. His death led to the Carlist Wars, a series of dynastic disputes that pitted supporters of his daughter Isabella against those of his brother Don Carlos. These conflicts, deeply rooted in questions of legitimacy and succession, fractured Spanish society and weakened the monarchy's standing. The Bourbon presence in southern Italy also came under pressure. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, ruled by the Bourbon line descending from Charles III, faced growing demands for reform and unification. While they resisted liberal movements and upheld a conservative monarchy, they were eventually overthrown during the Italian unification process in the mid-19th century. The Bourbon king Francis II fled, and the territories were annexed into the new Kingdom of Italy, marking the end of Bourbon rule in the Italian peninsula. Despite these setbacks, the Bourbon legacy continued to shape European politics and identity. Their presence in multiple nations helped preserve monarchical traditions in an age increasingly skeptical of royal authority. Their courts, institutions, and reforms influenced the development of legal systems, educational models, and national identities. Even after abdications and overthrows, Bourbon claimants maintained symbolic and sometimes practical roles in their respective countries. Today, the Bourbon legacy endures in various forms across Europe. In Spain, the Bourbon monarchy remains an active constitutional institution. After decades of republicanism and dictatorship in the 20th century, King Juan Carlos, a Bourbon descendant, played a pivotal role in the transition to democracy following the death of Francisco Franco. His decision to support democratic reforms and parliamentary governance helped stabilize Spain and solidified the monarchy's place in the modern state. Though his later years were marred by controversy and scandal, his contribution to Spain's democratic consolidation remains significant. The current Spanish monarch, King Felipe VI, represents a new generation of Bourbons committed to a modern and transparent monarchy. His role, though largely ceremonial, reflects a blend of tradition and contemporary values. Under his reign, the royal family has sought to reconnect with the Spanish public, emphasizing unity, civic responsibility, and adherence to democratic principles. In a country marked by regional tensions and political upheaval, the Bourbon crown acts as a symbolic anchor of continuity. Elsewhere in Europe, the Bourbon name lives on in the hearts of royalists, historians, and those who cherish monarchical heritage. There are still pretenders to the French throne, both from the senior Bourbon line and from the House of Orleans. Though they hold no formal power, these claimants maintain a presence in public life through charity, cultural events, and historical commemorations. Their continued visibility keeps the memory of the Bourbon dynasty alive and contributes to ongoing debates about monarchy, republicanism, and national identity in France. The architectural, artistic, and institutional legacies of the Bourbons are visible across the continent. The opulent palaces of Versailles, Caserta, and El Escorial remain enduring testaments to Bourbon ambition and cultural patronage. These sites attract millions of visitors each year and serve as monuments to the grandeur and complexity of Bourbon rule. Museums, libraries, and universities founded or enriched by Bourbon monarchs continue to contribute to European intellectual life. In many ways, their investments in culture and infrastructure outlasted their political regimes. The Bourbon influence also extended to religion and the church. Many Bourbon monarchs were staunch defenders of Catholicism, often positioning themselves as protectors of the faith in a rapidly changing world. Their relationship with the papacy, though sometimes fraught, underscored their commitment to a moral and spiritual vision of governance. This legacy has influenced modern debates on the role of religion in public life and the intersection between spiritual authority and political power. In the modern European consciousness, the Bourbons represent both the zenith of monarchical power and the complex journey toward democratic governance. They embody the contradictions of a dynasty that could be enlightened and repressive, reformist and reactionary, unified and divided. Their rise and fall reflect broader trends in European history. The shift from feudalism to centralization, from divine right to constitutionalism, from monarchy to modern statehood. The story of the Bourbons is ultimately a story of adaptation. Some members of the dynasty resisted change and were swept away by revolution. Others embraced new roles and found ways to remain relevant. Their experience illustrates the challenges faced by traditional institutions in the face of modern ideologies. The fact that Bourbon monarchies, particularly in Spain, still exist today is a testament to the enduring appeal of constitutional monarchy as a form of governance that balances heritage with contemporary values. As Europe continues to evolve, the Bourbon legacy remains a source of fascination and debate. Historians examine their policies and personalities, artists draw inspiration from their courtly grandeur, and political thinkers reflect on their successes and failures. The Bourbons, once rulers of empires and shapers of destinies, now stand as figures of historical reflection, symbols of a Europe that once was and a Europe that still bears their imprint. Their influence is not confined to textbooks or palaces. It lives on in the very institutions, cultures, and narratives that define the continent today. The Bourbon dynasty, often associated with grandeur, opulence, and the political transformations of Europe, has long held a prominent place in historical narratives. While major figures such as Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, or Philip V of Spain dominate textbooks and public memory, countless lesser-known stories have quietly shaped the destiny of nations and the evolution of societies under Bourbon rule. These hidden tales, buried beneath the more public spectacles of war and politics, reveal a rich tapestry of personal intrigue, cultural flourishing, and social transformation that goes far beyond the traditional image of monarchs and courts. To truly understand the legacy of the Bourbons, one must look beyond their crowns and titles to uncover the stories that history books have too often overlooked. In the glittering court of Versailles, much attention is paid to the king's power, the elaborate rituals, and the architectural splendor. Yet it is in the margins of court life that one finds the more human side of Bourbon rule. Courtiers, artists, advisors, and even mistresses played critical roles in shaping policy and public perception. One such figure was Madame de Pompadour, the official chief mistress of Louis XV. Far from being a mere romantic partner, she wielded considerable political influence, patronized the arts, and shaped the Enlightenment-era cultural agenda of France. Her support for writers like Voltaire and her backing of new artistic styles, such as Rococo, helped to usher in a period of immense creative energy that extended well beyond the palace walls. Another often overlooked story is that of the scientific patronage initiated by several Bourbon monarchs. While Louis XIV is frequently remembered for his military campaigns and expansionist ambitions, he also invested heavily in the development of French science. Under his reign, the academia sciences flourished, and notable figures such as Christian Huygens and Jean-Baptiste Colbert advanced astronomical studies, physics, and early forms of data collection. These investments had a cascading effect on the intellectual climate of Europe, positioning Bourbon France as a center of innovation and inquiry. It was a legacy that continued with later monarchs, even as political turmoil began to challenge their authority. In Spain, the Bourbon story takes on a distinct yet equally complex character. When Philip V ascended to the Spanish throne, he brought with him not only a new royal lineage, but also a wave of administrative reforms inspired by French models. However, behind these sweeping changes were stories of resistance, adaptation, and local negotiation. Many regional identities in Spain, particularly in Catalonia and the Basque Country, clashed with the centralized Bourbon vision of governance. Lesser-known local uprisings, bureaucratic negotiations, and acts of cultural preservation played out across the Iberian Peninsula as communities responded to this new era of rule. Despite their reputation for authoritarianism, several Bourbon rulers made sincere attempts to reform and modernize their societies. In the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, a lesser-studied Bourbon domain, King Charles III and his successors embarked on a series of reforms aimed at improving education, healthcare, and economic development. These efforts often went unrecognized due to later failures and the eventual collapse of the monarchy, but they nonetheless laid the groundwork for southern Italy's brief moment of cultural and intellectual flowering. Notable institutions such as the Capodimonte Museum and the Royal Palace of Caserta emerged during this time, blending Neapolitan creativity with Bourbon grandeur. Beneath the political surface, the Bourbons left an indelible mark on cultural life across Europe. Their courts were not just centers of power, but also hubs of artistic expression, scientific curiosity, and philosophical debate. In France, the Bourbon sponsorship of the arts reached its zenith during the reign of Louis XIV, who not only commissioned the construction of Versailles, but also promoted music, painting, literature, and theater. Composers such as Jean-Baptiste Lully and writers like Molière and Racine found patronage at court, and their works continue to be celebrated centuries later. These creations were not simply decorative. They helped to define a French cultural identity that was deeply tied to the monarchy and its vision of civilization. Similarly, in Spain, the Bourbon monarchs cultivated a unique artistic environment that blended local traditions with international trends. The construction of the Royal Palace of Madrid, inspired by French and Italian architecture, symbolized this fusion of influences. The Bourbon interest in collecting and preserving art led to the establishment of institutions such as the Prado Museum, which houses some of the world's greatest masterpieces. Artists like Francisco Goya found both inspiration and conflict within the Bourbon context, producing works that reflected the complexities of monarchy, revolution, and human suffering. What makes the Bourbon contribution to culture particularly significant is the way it extended beyond elite circles. Educational reforms in both France and Spain aimed to broaden access to knowledge, albeit within the constraints of monarchical control. Universities were expanded, scientific societies were established, and new forms of public discourse began to emerge. The press, though censored, became an increasingly important tool for shaping public opinion. Even fashion, cuisine, and etiquette were transformed by Bourbon influence, helping to standardize and spread cultural norms throughout their realms. The relationship between the Bourbons and religion also shaped the social fabric of their domains. While staunch defenders of Catholic orthodoxy, several Bourbon monarchs navigated complex relationships with the papacy, local clergy, and religious orders. These interactions influenced everything from education to healthcare to urban planning. For instance, in Bourbon Naples, religious institutions were deeply involved in charitable work and provided vital services in areas where the state's reach was limited. This fusion of religious and royal power created a uniquely Bourbon model of governance that relied on both divine legitimacy and practical administration. In more personal and intimate terms, the Bourbon dynasty was shaped by individuals whose stories have been largely forgotten by mainstream narratives. The lives of illegitimate children, marginalized court members, and royal women often unfolded in the shadows of more prominent figures, but had profound effects on the direction of the monarchy. For example, the daughters of Louis XV, collectively known as Mesdames, wielded quiet yet substantial influence over court life, religious policy, and dynastic strategy. Their correspondence, charitable endeavors, and political interventions reveal a rich world of female agency within a patriarchal system. Throughout their history, the Bourbons faced crises that tested their resilience and adaptability. One such episode occurred during the French Revolution, when many members of the family were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Yet even in the midst of chaos, they found ways to maintain their networks and rebuild their influence. The story of Marie-Therese, daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, illustrates this resilience. Imprisoned during the Revolution and later exiled, she became a symbol of Bourbon legitimacy and restoration, navigating exile and political uncertainty with remarkable determination. The impact of the Bourbon dynasty extends into the modern world in both visible and subtle ways. In Spain, the monarchy remains a constitutional institution, a living link to the Bourbon past. The modern Spanish royal family, descended from Bourbon lines, continues to play a ceremonial role in national life, offering a sense of continuity amidst political change. King Juan Carlos I, who reigned during the late 20th century, was instrumental in Spain's transition from dictatorship to democracy, demonstrating how Bourbon figures could evolve and respond to contemporary needs. Beyond monarchies, the Bourbon legacy lives on in the cultural institutions they helped to establish and the historical memory they continue to evoke. Museums, libraries, palaces, and universities across Europe bear the imprint of Bourbon patronage. Their contributions to legal codes, administrative practices, and educational systems can still be seen in modern European states. Even the debates over monarchy versus republicanism in countries like France reflect the enduring influence of Bourbon ideals, both as inspiration and as counterpoint. In literature and film, the Bourbons remain a source of fascination, often portrayed with a mix of admiration and critique. From portrayals of Marie Antoinette's tragic fate to fictionalized accounts of court intrigue, popular culture continues to revisit the Bourbon world with fresh eyes. These representations, while sometimes romanticized, also serve to keep the dynasty in the public imagination, prompting new generations to engage with the complexities of history. The Bourbon story is not merely one of past glories or fallen thrones. It is a narrative of endurance, adaptation, and legacy. Their ability to shape society, culture, and politics across multiple centuries and regions speaks to their extraordinary influence. Yet it is the untold stories, the quiet reformers, the forgotten artists, the hidden advisors, that enrich our understanding of what the Bourbon dynasty truly represented. These lesser-known figures and events offer a more complete and nuanced picture, reminding us that history is never just about the victors or the famous, but also about those who worked behind the scenes, struggled on the margins, and left their mark in ways both profound and enduring. Even today, the Bourbon name evokes a certain mystique, a blend of regal authority and cultural sophistication. Whether viewed through the lens of political history, artistic achievement, or social transformation, the Bourbon dynasty remains one of the most fascinating and impactful families in European history. Their story is far from over, and as new research and perspectives continue to emerge, the hidden layers of their legacy will no doubt come further into light. It is in these stories, both celebrated and concealed, that the full measure of the Bourbon influence can be understood, offering timeless lessons on power, identity, and the human experience. The story of the Bourbon Dynasty, in all its grandeur, turmoil, and hidden intricacies, is more than a chronicle of kings and queens. It is a reflection of human ambition, resilience, and the enduring pursuit of legacy. From the opulent courts of Versailles and Madrid to the reformist aspirations in Naples and beyond, the Bourbons left an indelible mark not only on the pages of history, but also in the hearts of the societies they touched. Their legacy, while shaped by power, was also enriched by art, ideas, culture, and the courage of individuals who dared to dream and create in the shadows of palaces. Though their thrones may have risen and fallen, the influence of the Bourbons lives on in the institutions they built, the cultural treasures they fostered, and the stories that continue to inspire. Their journey reminds us that history is not only defined by victories and defeats, but by the values we uphold, the beauty we nurture, and the lives we impact across generations. In a world still shaped by the echoes of the past, the Bourbon legacy stands as a powerful testament to the importance of vision, the strength found in adaptation, and the profound impact that individuals, whether crowned or common, can have on the world. Let their story inspire us to seek greatness not through conquest alone, but through wisdom, creativity, and compassion that endure far beyond our own time.